How did the First World War transform the world? When most people think of the First World War, or World War I as we call it now, we focus on the impact that it had on leading to World War II and the rises of both fascism and communism. And although those certainly were important impacts that World War I left, it overshadows the big picture, and that is that World War I was an epochal conflict that destroyed the stability of the 19th century. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, it basically means it was a huge global conflict that brought around the end of an era. It brought an end to the European dominance, and it led to the rise of the United States as a global power. It ended ancient traditions, as it led to waves of new technologies that transformed both the way wars and life were fought and lived. And lastly, it ended the reigns of monarchs in the monarchy, and it led to the rise of democracy, with both its goods, positives, and negatives throughout the world. To start, let's look at how World War I brought an end to European dominance. And this, perhaps, is fairly straightforward, but it's also not at all. Now, the most clear impact is that it killed 40 million people, most of whom were European. Although they're not everybody involved in World War I that died was European, the majority of them were, and with only a population of 480 million, this was a devastating impact to Europe. But there's another aspect here that most people tend not to think about. As Gulami Vanderboek says, half of its demographic impact is accounted for by the collapse of fertility during the war. End quote. What does this mean, you might be wondering? Well, the answer is that not only were people being killed during World War I, they were also not being born. Simply put, the rate of birth dropped drastically during World War I. And this in part was due to the fact that a large number of men were out in foreign countries fighting in wars and didn't get to see their wives or girlfriends, but this meant that 40 million people were not only killed, but also not born. And with such a huge demographic impact, Europe's power collapsed. The United States, on the other hand, was not affected on the same scale and was able to take Europe's place as a global leader. But perhaps we should try and figure out what exactly caused this collapse. And why did the thriving society of Europe fall apart? Well, to this, we can turn to John Calhoun in an experiment that he did performed on mice in a utopia. So the experiment he performed had a large number of mice in a cage, but they had everything they could ever want. They had unlimited food, unlimited water, a standard temperature, and it was frequently clean, so they could never have to worry about anything. But despite all these benefits in perfect society they lived in, as the population grew, society collapsed. Some of the mice became secluded, refusing to eat, drink, or mate, and spent all their time grooming themselves and were called the beautiful ones. Others stayed in the more central areas and were constantly fighting, just committing random acts of aggression. Some mothers were eating their own young, and there's general they just fought themselves, and eventually all the mice ended up dead. Now, this seems very strange, but what real-world impact does this have? Well, there are 5 main takeaways we can grasp from this experiment. Firstly, that prolonged prosperity leads to the disappearance of masculinity. Secondly, that social isolation from large populations leads to random acts of aggression. Lastly, thirdly, society's extinction is caused by prolonged prosperity. Living too long for too well will inevitably destroy society. Fourth, the dense populations, areas that are densely populated, force women to take over the role of men as they lose their masculinity. And lastly, not providing new generations with work leads to them self-destructing. And we can see all of these things took place in Europe during World War I. They had just come off one of the best centuries in Europe's history. Everybody was thriving, prospering, and then it all fell apart. And perhaps see how this better, we can look at how World War I started. There was, in fact, effectively no cause whatsoever. Whereas World War II had a clear start with Hitler invading Poland, World War I started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and all the other countries joined for little to no reason very quickly. As a result, society collapsed, and society in Europe collapsed, and USA became a global power. But this was far from the only way that World War I transformed the world. It also transformed the world technologically. Trench warfare was started. Airplanes were invented, and there were rapid developments as they were used for spying, bombing, and just fighting in general. But the poison gas became a widespread threat throughout to everybody during World War I. There was some sort of drones, which were basically just somewhat guided missiles that were launched already during World War I. But not everything was used for harm. Plastic surgery was started, even if it was not on the same scale we have today. Blood banks were started such that people that needed to have their blood let, quite common considering the impacts of the war, would not have to lose all their blood and instead could get it back. Because there were airplanes, so air control was started. And not only for airplanes, but also for the Zeppelins that were emerging. But let's take a deeper look at one of these impacts, which is trench warfare. Because not only do we see the rise of new technology, but we also see the death of old technology and ancient traditions. The way trench warfare worked is that people would just dig out trenches, which were, in fact, quite complicated to be built rather than just holes in the ground, and they would stay into these trenches because it provided them additional protection. But this was a completely revolutionary way to fight wars. No longer were soldiers just lining up in lines and then shooting at each other or mindlessly rushing at each other. Or at least when they did mindlessly rush at each other, most of them often ended up dead due to machine guns. But one of the major threats to trench warfare was poison gas, which for both defenses for and the use of rapidly grew during the war as it became more and more toxic to be even anywhere close to the poison gas. But as the trench warfare shows, the World War I drastically changed people's perception of warfare and how wars should be fought. And as Indy Nadal says, quote, "The stalemate on the Western Front that persisted through much of the war prompted the most intensive use of chemical weapons in history. Terrible as the use of chemical weapons was and still is, it is undeniable that this technology transformed the world during World War I. But moving beyond the battles and destructions that took place, World War I also was an epochal conflict that transformed the world through one last way, and that is through the rise of democracy. Now, the best way to see this is through the United States of America. And when you think of America, you'll quite quickly realize that it is not a monarchy, and instead either a democracy or a republic, depending on who you ask. But the entire reason that Woodrow Wilson, or at least the entire reason that he claimed America should join the war, was to prevent autocracy. He viewed democracy as the ideal and joined the war to spread it against the dangers of autocracy. As Dr. Christopher Burkitt says, the United States should enter war, Wilson argued, to combat a new and more abstract enemy, autocracy. And when the United States and the Allies won World War I, it led to the fall of many monarchs, and instead, democracy was forcefully implemented in many of these places. This is far to say from saying that this democracy was a good thing, as it was through democracy that Hitler became the leader of Germany. However, a complete change in how almost all these governments were run is an undeniable impact of World War I. And we can also see one of these cons from democracy in the rise of propaganda. Now, propaganda was not unique to World War I and had been invented and widely used by governments long before then. But it was brought to the front in World War I because of the rise of democracy. Under a monarch or autocracy, keeping your people happy is important, but it is not essential to maintaining your power. However, in a democracy, if you lose the support of the majority of the people, you will soon lose all your power. As such, propaganda became much more mainstream during World War I, and countries like the United States, Britain, and Germany all used it for different purposes. In Britain, they focused on portraying Germany as a despicable enemy, and the worst example of this was the Cadaver Verwaltungsstandstaat, which, although very complicated, was the theory that there was a German organization that collected human bodies and boiled them out for the fat and gelatin and the like. Now this would of course be a terrible thing if the Germans were actually doing it. And it was, although of course not true, we can easily tell it was not true now, the people during Britain during World War I had no clue and would readily flock to the army registrations to fight against the evil Germans. But this is not to say there were no... part of the reason that propaganda was so influential was because of the rises of technology. With the uses of with televisions, radios, and other sorts of mass communications much more widestream and easily available, this fake, or sometimes real, news about the enemy was able to be spread widely and quickly. Overall, World War I completely transformed the world, from bringing an end to European dominance, ending ancient traditions, and leading to new technologies, to leading to a rise of democracy with both its positives and negatives. World War I completely destroyed the stability of the 19th century.